Before we dive in, I'd like to ask a small favor. I'm pouring all my energy into reaching my goal of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to me. Please, I'm asking you to hit that subscribe button. It's just a single click, but it gives me tremendous motivation to keep creating more videos. Thank you so much.
Eliza Thornton pressed her fingernails into her palm until the pain was the only real thing left in that room. Her stepmother's voice rang out above the candlelight, sharp as a slap. The girl could not even read a dinner invitation, let alone a ledger. Laughter followed. Every face turned, and Eliza did not cry. She lifted her chin, breathed once, and made a silent promise to herself that before summer's end, every soul at that table would know exactly what she could read. The summer of 1815 arrived in Hudson Valley like a fever that wouldn't break. Heat pressed down on the Thornton estate from the first week of June, baking the fields gold before their time, drawing sweat from the necks of field hands and fine ladies alike. The roses along the front walk bloomed early and loud, and the wide porch of Thornton Manor caught whatever breeze came off the river, which most evenings was almost none at all. It was the kind of heat that made tempers short and truths harder to swallow. Eliza Thornton had learned to survive both. She was 22 years old, the only surviving child of Edmund Thornton, merchant and landowner, who had died 18 months prior of a fever of his own, the kind that takes a man in 3 days and leaves behind nothing but debts on paper, and a widow with plans already made. Eliza had stood at his grave in January's rain, with her hands folded and her jaw set, and she had not wept where anyone could see her. She had wept later, alone in the little room at the back of the house that used to be her father's study, before Margot Hensley Thornton redecorated it into a sitting room, smelling of French perfume and ambition. Edmund Thornton had taught his daughter to read numbers before she could read words. He'd sat her up on the counting-house stool at the age of 6 and run his finger down columns of figures, patient as a schoolmaster, proud as a father, saying, "These are the bones of a household, Eliza. You learn to read these, you'll never be foolish, you'll never be lost." She had believed him. She had also believed, until she was old enough to understand otherwise, that the world would recognize what her father had taught her as a gift. It had not. What the world saw when it looked at Eliza Thornton was a plain-dressed, quiet-spoken young woman with ink stains that wouldn't quite wash off her fingers, and a habit of going still and watchful in company rather than bright and animated. What the world saw increasingly was exactly what Margot wanted it to see, nothing worth remembering. The dinner that changed everything was held on the 14th of June, 1815, at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Havford, whose estate sat 3 miles east along the river road. The Havfords were the kind of people who threw dinners not for the pleasure of company, but for the pleasure of being seen throwing dinners, and the guest list had been assembled with the precision of a military campaign. Margot Hensley Thornton had dressed for war. She wore cream and gold colors that announced money and comfort, and her dark hair was pinned with a set of jet combs that had belonged, Eliza happened to know, to Eliza's own mother. But there was no point saying so. There never had been. Eliza wore a gown that had fit her better 2 years ago, and she wore it because it was the best she had. Margot controlled the household accounts now, had controlled them since the week after the funeral when she'd sat down at Edmund's desk with Mr. Clayton at her elbow and reorganized everything to her satisfaction. The carriage ride to the Havfords was silent, except for Margot's commentary on the dust in the road, and Eliza's half-sister Cecily, chattering about a new ribbon she'd ordered from Boston. "You're not to speak unless spoken to tonight," Margot said as they turned up the drive, not looking at Eliza. "The Ashford heir will be present. He's recently come into management of the Ashford estate from his uncle, and his connections are considerable. The last thing I need is you stumbling over your words and making the family look small." "I'll try not to embarrass you," Eliza said. "You always try," Margot said. "You rarely succeed." Cecily laughed, not unkindly. She had her mother's reflexes, if not quite her mother's cruelty. The Havford house was lit like a celebration. Candles in every window, voices carrying from the front hall, and on the wide lawn, men in dark coats, talking in clusters with glasses already in hand. Eliza followed Margot through the entry without being introduced. She found a spot near the far end of the front parlor where she could watch without being watched. And she had been there perhaps 10 minutes when she felt the particular quality of silence that precedes someone important entering a room. Nathaniel Ashford was not what she'd expected. She had expected someone who looked the way Wealth looked in Hudson Valley, broad-shouldered, easy in his skin, a little bored. He was those things. But he moved differently than most men of his station. He moved like a man who was paying attention. He stood in the doorway and took a slow measure of the room, and for one moment his eyes settled on her, not with particular interest, but with the specific, careful stillness of someone filing information away, and then he moved on. He was perhaps 30, dark hair, sun-darkened from time outdoors, a quality of quietness about him that sat oddly against the brightness of the room. She filed that away in return, and returned to watching. The trouble started at dinner. 14 people at the Havford table, and Margot had somehow arranged herself directly across from the Ashford heir, with Eliza placed 4 seats down between Mr. Havford's elderly mother and a young lawyer from Poughkeepsie who spent the first 2 courses talking about property law in a way that suggested he found himself endlessly fascinating. The conversation at Margot's end of the table was louder, brighter, calculated for an audience. Eliza caught fragments of it. Margot, speaking of Edmund Thornton's estate, with the nostalgic authority of a woman who had built it with her own hands, which was the precise opposite of the truth, and kept her attention on her plate. It was Mrs. Havford who detonated it, innocently enough, asking in a caring voice whether Eliza had any interest in the management of the Thornton accounts, now that she was of age. Silence spread from that question like a ripple. Margot turned her head with the slow, deliberate composure of a woman who had prepared for exactly this moment. "Eliza," she said, lifting her voice with gentle, practiced condescension, "I'm afraid Eliza has no head for numbers. She never did. Edmund spoiled her with affection and left the education rather to the side." She gave a small, sad smile. "She can barely read a dinner invitation, let alone a ledger. I manage the accounts myself, naturally. Someone has to." Laughter. Not raucous, polite drawing room laughter, which was somehow worse. The lawyer from Poughkeepsie turned to look at Eliza with the particular expression of a man recalculating whether she was worth his conversation. Eliza sat down her fork with extreme care. She did not look at Margot. She looked instead at the tablecloth, then at her own hands, and she breathed once through her nose and made the calculation she always made, the cost of speaking against the cost of silence. The dinner table, the guests, Margot's smile, patient and inviting her to react. She swallowed the words she had and replaced them with nothing. "You're very gracious to take it on," Mrs. Havford said warmly to Margot. "She's always managed wonderfully," Cecily added. Eliza picked her fork back up. From 4 seats away, Nathaniel Ashford had not laughed. She didn't look at him. She knew somehow. Anyway, the after-dinner hour was the cruelest part of any social occasion Eliza attended. The ladies withdrew, while the men had their port and their politics. And in the drawing room, Margot was at her finest. Gracious, amusing, the charming widow, managing difficulty with courage and good humor, and poor Eliza in the background, confirming every word of it simply by existing silently. She slipped out to the hallway when she could. The Havford house had a library at the end of the east corridor, and the door stood open 2 inches. She pushed it wider and went in because it was quiet, and because there were books, and because no one would follow her there. She stood in the middle of the room and let out a breath that seemed to have been waiting since Margot spoke at the table. She can barely read a dinner invitation. 18 months. 18 months of watching Margot systematically dismantle everything Edmund Thornton had built and everything Edmund Thornton had said about his daughter, brick by brick, in every parlor and at every table in the county. And Eliza had swallowed it. She had been quiet. She had been patient. She had told herself that patience was strategy and that her time would come. She was beginning to wonder if she had been wrong. "You don't look like a woman who belongs in a library at a dinner party," said a voice from behind her. "Most people in that situation look relieved. You look like you're deciding something." She turned. Nathaniel Ashford stood in the doorway, with 2 glasses and the unhurried manner of a man who had also found the drawing room insufficient. "I was," she said, "deciding something." "And did you?" She considered him. He had not laughed. That still meant something, though she couldn't yet say what. "I haven't finished yet." He crossed the room and set one of the glasses on the table beside her, then moved to the shelves as if he'd been in this library before, running a casual hand along a row of spines. "I heard what Mrs. Thornton said at table," he said. "I don't make a habit of inserting myself into family matters. But she said—" He turned. There was something in his expression that was not quite amusement, and not quite sympathy, something more careful than either. "Your stepmother told a room full of people that you can't read. You didn't argue the point, would you have?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've never been in that particular position." "No," she agreed, "you haven't." A beat passed. The sound of voices from down the hall drifted and faded. "My Uncle Stuart left the estate in some disorder," Nathaniel said. "I've inherited a man named Clayton in that position who came recommended, but I haven't been able to verify whether the recommendations bear out." He paused. "I'm told by Mrs. Whitaker, my housekeeper, who is not given to exaggeration, that the quarterly accounts from the last 3 years don't reconcile. I've been looking for someone with a head for numbers who isn't directly employed by my estate to take a look." She was very still. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're standing in a library at a dinner party," he said, "and you haven't touched the glass I set down, which tells me you have a clear head, and because the expression on your face when your stepmother spoke was not confusion, it was restraint." He looked at her steadily. A woman who can't read numbers doesn't exercise restraint about being told she can't read numbers. She exercises confusion or embarrassment. You exercised restraint. The silence between them stretched. Eliza reached for the glass and held it without drinking, thinking, "You're asking me to examine your steward's accounts. I'm asking if you'd be willing to look. Why? You don't know me." "No," he said, "but I watched you at that table for 2 courses, and I know that you see things. I need someone who sees things." She turned the glass slowly in her hand. Her father's voice, low and steady from 20 years back. "These are the bones of a household. You learn to read these, you'll never be lost." "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. Mrs. Whitaker will chaperone, and I'll have the ledgers ready in the study by 9. She set the glass down. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "I'll need 3 days at minimum if the accounts go back 3 years, and I'll need access to the original invoices, not just the ledger summaries. I don't work from summaries." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly, more like confirmation. 3 days, he said, and the invoices done. She had told Margot she'd been invited to assist with a charitable accounts committee at the Ashford estate. It wasn't entirely untrue. Nathaniel Ashford was, she would learn, genuinely committed to charitable works, and Margot, who was currently attempting to establish herself as a woman of social relevance in the Hudson Valley, would not refuse a connection to the Ashford name, even a peripheral one. "Keep yourself presentable," was all Margot said. "And don't speak unless you're spoken to." Eliza rode out the next morning in the Thornton gig with the family's one hired driver, wearing her second-best dress and carrying her father's old leather satchel, which Margot had never bothered to confiscate because she'd never understood what was in it. What was in it was a wooden ruler, 2 sharpened pencils, a piece of India rubber, and a small notebook with Edmund Thornton's handwriting in the first dozen pages and Eliza's in the rest. Mrs. Whitaker met her at the door of Ashford House. She was a woman somewhere north of 60, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have been running large households for decades and have no patience left for wasted gesture. She looked Eliza over once, top to bottom, and said, "Mr. Ashford said you were sharp. You'd best be. Clayton's been at those books for 3 years, and I have not slept soundly for 2 of them." "What do you suspect?" Eliza said. "Everything," Mrs. Whitaker said. "Come in, and I'll show you." The study was cool and north-facing, the curtains half-drawn against the morning sun. The ledgers were laid out on the wide center table, 6 of them thick, bound in brown leather, accompanied by 2 wooden boxes of loose invoices and receipts bundled in twine. Eliza sat down her satchel, pulled out her pencil, opened the first ledger to its first page, and got to work. Oh. She had been working for 40 minutes when she found the first discrepancy. It was small, a payment to a mill supplier in April of 1813, listed in the ledger at $42 with a corresponding invoice in the box. But the invoice, when she laid it flat and read the figures, said $38.40, not enough in isolation to mean anything except error. She wrote it down. She went back to the ledger and turned pages, slowly running her finger down each column, not reading for narrative, but for pattern, the way her father had taught her, the way a musician listens, not for individual notes, but for the shape of a melody. By noon, she had found 11 discrepancies, all small, all in the same direction. Payments recorded higher than the corresponding invoices, the difference accumulating like water pooling in a low place. She sat back in her chair and looked at what she had. Mrs. Whitaker appeared in the doorway with a tray. "Luncheon," she said. "Have you found something?" "I've found a method," Eliza said carefully. "I need to finish the ledgers before I'll know how much." Mrs. Whitaker set the tray down. She looked at the notebook where Eliza had been recording her findings, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has suspected something for a long time and is now watching it be confirmed. "Clayton's coming to the estate this afternoon. She said he comes on Tuesdays to report to Mr. Ashford." "Does Mr. Ashford meet with him privately in the study?" "Yes." Eliza looked at the books laid out before her. "Could you ask Mr. Ashford to meet with me before Clayton arrives? I won't have the full picture, but I'll have enough." Mrs. Whitaker studied her for a moment. "You're quite sure?" "I'm quite sure of what I've found so far," Eliza said, which is enough to tell him the investigation is worth finishing. "He won't be easy about it," Mrs. Whitaker said. "He trusted Clayton." "Men who trust the wrong people never are easy about it," Eliza said. "That's why they need someone who wasn't doing the trusting in the first place." Mrs. Whitaker was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "I'll tell him you'd like a word at 2 o'clock." "Thank you, ma'am." The housekeeper picked up the empty tray and turned to leave, and then paused. "Miss Thornton," she said without turning around, "your father was Edmund Thornton, the merchant out of Pipsey." "Yes, ma'am. He was a good man," Mrs. Whitaker said. "A fair one. He came through here on trade business 3 or 4 times over the years. Mr. Ashford, the previous Mr. Ashford, Nathaniel's uncle, thought well of him." She paused again. "I'm glad it's you sitting in that chair." She left before Eliza could answer. Eliza turned back to the ledgers, pressed her pencil to the page, and kept working. Nathaniel Ashford came to the study 5 minutes before 2. He looked at the notebooks, the spread of invoices, the ledgers open at marked pages, and at Eliza, who had removed her gloves to work, and had ink on 2 fingers, and had not had time to care about it, and he pulled out the opposite chair and sat down without being invited. "What have you found?" he said. 11 confirmed discrepancies in the 1813 ledger alone, she said, each one small, between $3 and $7, each one in the same direction. The ledger records a higher amount than the invoice justifies. The difference goes into a line item labeled contingency expenses, which is a real category in estate accounting, but is being used here as a drain. He was very still. How much? In 1813, across the entries, I verified approximately $62, but I've only finished the first ledger. She met his eyes steadily. If the pattern holds across 3 years of quarterly accounts, you're looking at significantly more. How significantly? I need 2 more days to tell you with certainty, she said, but if I had to estimate from the pattern of the first ledger, somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000, possibly more. The quality of his stillness changed. Clayton has been my steward for 3 years, he said. Yes. He came with letters of recommendation from 3 different landowners. I know, she said. I'd be interested to examine those letters if you still have them. Something moved across his face. Anger, Eliza thought, but disciplined anger, the kind that knows where it's pointed, not at her. You think the recommendations may have been fabricated. I think it's worth verifying, she said. A man who falsifies accounts in small amounts for 3 years is not impulsive. He's careful. Careful men plan their exits and their entrances both. Nathaniel sat forward and put his elbows on the table, looking at the open ledger between them. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He arrives at 3 o'clock. I know. What do you want to do?" She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since 11:30, when the pattern had become unmistakable, and she had felt something clarify inside her. Not triumph, not yet, but purpose. The clean, certain feeling of a woman who has the right tools and knows how to use them. "Let him come," she said. "Let him make his report as usual. Don't let him know anything's changed. And," she paused, "let me finish the ledgers." He looked at her. "You have 2 more days," he said. "I want the full accounting before I move." "You'll have it," she said. He stood, and she thought he would leave, but he paused at the door. "Miss Thornton," he said, "your stepmother told a room full of people last night that you can barely read." "She did," Eliza agreed. "She is going to regret that," he said quietly, "before this is done." He left. Eliza looked at the 6 ledgers on the table, at the boxes of invoices, at her own notebook full of careful figures, and she breathed once, deep and steady, and turned to page 1 of ledger number 2. These are the bones of a household. She could read them just fine. The second ledger was worse than the first. Eliza had known it would be. Pattern was pattern. Once a careful man found a method that worked, he didn't abandon it. He refined it. And Clayton had refined it. By the middle of the 1814 accounts, the discrepancies had grown not in frequency, but in size. $7 became $12. $12 became $20. The contingency line expanded like a slow leak in a hole, steady and almost invisible, unless you knew to look for it below the waterline. She recorded every figure in her notebook. Date, ledger entry, invoice amount, difference, column after column of quiet, damning arithmetic. She was halfway through the second ledger when the study door opened without a knock, and she looked up to find a man she hadn't met standing in the doorway, with his hat still on and a leather document case under his arm, and an expression that said he owned this room and everything in it. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since settled into a watchful, calculating arrangement. His eyes found her immediately, found her, assessed her, and dismissed her in the space of half a breath. "Who are you?" he said. "I might ask the same," Eliza said. She didn't stand. His jaw tightened. "I'm the estate steward. I have a meeting with Mr. Ashford at 3 o'clock. He glanced at the ledgers spread across the table. "Those are estate documents." "They are," she agreed. "You have no business touching them." "Mr. Ashford asked me to review them," she said. "He'll be with you shortly, I expect." Clayton's eyes moved across the table slowly, with the specific attention of a man reading a room for danger. They stopped at her notebook. She had left it open to her working page. "What is that?" he said. "My notes," Eliza said. He took a step forward. She closed the notebook. Something shifted in his face. Not alarm, not yet, but the particular alertness of a man who has operated in confidence for a long time and has just felt the ground change under him a fraction of an inch, in a way no one else would notice. "Mr. Ashford didn't mention he'd brought in outside help," Clayton said. "No," Eliza agreed. "I don't suppose he did." A beat passed. Then Nathaniel Ashford's voice came from the corridor. "Clayton, good. Come through to the east parlor, will you?" And Clayton held Eliza's gaze for one more second, flat and measuring, before he turned and went. Eliza opened her notebook and kept writing. She heard them through the wall. Not every word, but enough. Clayton's voice, smooth and confident, moving through a report that had clearly been practiced, numbers delivered with the ease of a man reciting a sermon he knew by heart. Nathaniel's responses were short, non-committal, the voice of a man who was listening for something other than what was being said. At 4:15, Mrs. Whitaker appeared with tea and closed the door behind her. "Well," she said, "the second year is worse than the first." "I'll need to know something," Eliza said without looking up. "Did Mr. Clayton ever manage the household accounts, or only the estate accounts?" Mrs. Whitaker was quiet for a moment. "Both. For a period, the summer of 1813, when Mr. Ashford's uncle was ill and there was no one else." "How long?" 4 months, roughly. Eliza wrote that down. "Is there a separate household ledger for that period?" "There should be. I can find it." "Please," Eliza said. "Tonight, if possible." Mrs. Whitaker set the tea tray down and looked at the table with the careful, unhurried expression of a woman assembling a verdict she'd already mostly reached. "How bad is it?" Eliza looked up. "Bad enough that I'm glad Mr. Ashford had the sense to ask someone to look." "He's not a foolish man," Mrs. Whitaker said. "He trusted too quickly, but that's a different fault." "It is," Eliza agreed. "A better fault than most." The housekeeper left. From down the corridor, Clayton's voice rose briefly. Something about the Southfield drainage projected costs, and then dropped again. Eliza turned the page and kept working. Clayton left at 4. Nathaniel came to the study at 5, and this time he closed the door. He glanced at the table, at the second ledger open, then the third one she'd just moved forward, and the notebook now crammed with 2 days of figures. He sat down in the chair opposite and remained silent for a moment. "I didn't know you'd found anything," he said finally. "I don't think so," Eliza replied. "He was watching me. He saw the notebook was open. He couldn't read it from where he stood, but he knew something was different. He's a careful man," she added. "Careful men notice when rooms feel different." Nathaniel looked at the notebook. "What did you find today?" "The second year is worse. The method is the same, but the amounts are larger, and by mid-1814 he's added a second channel." She turned to a marked page. "He's begun recording payments to a supplier named Hartwell and Sons for materials. There are 3 payments listed in the second half of 1814, totaling $214. "Hartwell and Sons?" Nathaniel repeated. "I don't know that name." "I don't believe you should," she said. "I went through every invoice in the second box. There are no invoices from Hartwell and Sons, not one." The silence that followed was heavy. "He invented a supplier," Nathaniel stated. "It appears so. A false payee is a more sophisticated method than inflated invoices. It requires more confidence." She paused, or the knowledge that no one is checking. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. A muscle twitched in his jaw. 3 years, he said. "I came to this estate 8 months ago. My uncle had been ill for 2 years before that, not able to manage the accounts himself. Clayton has had effectively unsupervised control since the spring of 1812. That's 3 full years of quarterly accounts," Eliza said. "I've finished 2 ledgers. I have 4 more. How much so far?" She looked at her notebook. Confirmed discrepancies across 1813 and 1814, $431. The Hartwell and Sons payments add another $214. Total confirmed to date, $645. He was quiet. And that's 2 ledgers of 6, she added. He stood and walked to the window, standing with his back to her. She let him have his silence, because she understood it. It wasn't just about money. It never was with men who had been trusted and betrayed. It was about the specific wound of having believed someone. My uncle trusted him, Nathaniel said finally. Yes, my uncle recommended him to me before he died. I know, he turned around. Is there any possibility this is a counting error? An honest mistake? She met his eyes. She had asked herself the same question 3 times that day because it was the right question and because she was honest. The discrepancies are consistent in direction, always in Clayton's favor, always in small amounts that individually wouldn't raise alarm. The Hartwell payments are invented wholesale. She paused. I want to be fair to the evidence, Mr. Ashford, but the pattern is not the pattern of mistake. It's the pattern of method. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, Finish the ledgers. Yes, she replied. And Miss Thornton. He picked up his hat from the side table where he'd placed it. Don't go anywhere alone on this property while Clayton is still employed here. I don't believe he's a violent man, but I also didn't believe he was a thief. She considered that. I'll be careful, she said. Good. He moved toward the door, then paused, the way he had the day before. It was becoming a habit of his, the pause, the almost exit, the thing he'd nearly left unsaid. Your father taught you this, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Every Saturday morning from the time I was 6, she said. He said, a woman who could read numbers would never be at anyone's mercy. Nathaniel Ashford looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to name. Something between sorrow and recognition, and underneath it, something quieter and less easily defined. He was right, he said, and left. Why? She had told Margot she'd been asked to extend the committee work by 2 additional days. Margot's reaction was precisely what Eliza had predicted, a narrowing of the eyes, a calculation of social benefit, and then a wave of the hand. Don't make yourself tiresome, Margot had said, and don't give them cause to think you're angling for a position. It'll look desperate. Of course not, Eliza replied. She went to bed that night and lay awake, running figures in her head, not anxiously, but the way a musician works through a difficult passage methodically until the shape of it is familiar. 431 plus 214 equals 645 confirmed. 4 ledgers remaining. If the pattern held and expanded as the first 2 suggested, the total was going to be something that would not be easy for anyone to look at. Quietly, she thought about Clayton's face in the study doorway. The flat, assessing look. The half-second when his eyes had gone to her notebook. He knew something had shifted. He didn't know how much. She needed to finish before he figured it out. She was at the Ashford study by 8 the next morning. The 3rd ledger broke open the case like a stone through ice. She found it before 10 o'clock. A payment in October of 1814, listed under Hartwell and Sons for $40, with a notation in Clayton's hand that read, Timber South Barn Repairs. She pulled the corresponding section of the invoice box and searched it twice, and then she found something she hadn't expected. An invoice. A real one, on real paper, from a real supplier in Pipsy, but not from Hartwell and Sons. It was from Linen Brothers for $31 for the same timber, for the same South Barn. He'd paid the real supplier with estate funds and then recorded a second, fraudulent payment to the fictitious account. Double billing. The same expense paid twice, once legitimately, once as theft. Her hand was very still on the page. She went back through the 3rd ledger from the beginning, not scanning now, but reading every entry against every invoice with the systematic patience of a woman who understood that she had just found a new dimension to the problem. By noon, She had found 4 instances of double billing in the third ledger alone, totaling $283. She set down her pencil and pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. The total was going to be substantial, more than she'd first estimated, possibly much more. Mrs. Whitaker appeared at the door with luncheon and the household ledger from the summer of 1813. She looked at Eliza's face and set the tray down without a word. "Double billing," Eliza said. Mrs. Whitaker sat down in the chair nearest the door with the careful, heavy movement of a woman receiving bad news she had half expected. "How much?" "I don't have the full count yet, but the household ledger you brought. I need to go through it this afternoon." She looked at the older woman. "Mrs. Whitaker, in the summer of 1813, were there any repairs or large purchases that seemed unusual? Anything you questioned at the time?" The housekeeper was quiet for a long moment. "There was a kitchen resupply," she said slowly. "Clayton said the prices had gone up from the usual suppliers and that he'd found a better source. I thought the amounts were high, but he had the invoices, and I wasn't in a position to—" She stopped. "The invoices may have been fabricated," Eliza said. "Or they may have been real invoices from real suppliers, with a second fraudulent payment layered over them." Mrs. Whitaker's mouth pressed into a flat, grim line. "How long has this been going on?" "At minimum since early 1813, Eliza said. "Possibly before. I need the ledgers from 1812. "Those would be in the archive room," Mrs. Whitaker said. "I'll get them." She stood, and Eliza thought she would go, but she paused, the same way Nathaniel did. That quality of something held back until the last moment. "Miss Thornton," she said, "Clayton came by this morning before you arrived." Eliza looked up sharply. "He came to the kitchen entrance. Mrs. Whitaker said he'd forgotten to leave a document for Mr. Ashford yesterday. I told him Mr. Ashford wasn't available. He asked if the committee lady was still working in the study." She paused. "He knows you're here. He knew yesterday." Eliza said, "He asked how long you'd be staying." The room was very quiet. "What did you tell him?" Eliza said. "I told him I didn't know," Mrs. Whitaker said, "which is true enough." She looked at Eliza steadily. "I also told Reuben, who handles the grounds, to keep an eye on the drive today." "Thank you," Eliza said. "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Whitaker said. "Get the work done." Nathaniel found her at 3 o'clock, still working, the fourth ledger open, the household ledger from 1813 set to one side with 17 pages marked by torn strips of paper. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him and looked up. His expression told her Mrs. Whitaker had already spoken to him. "Clayton came to the property this morning." "I know," he said. "He's not due here until next Tuesday." "I know that too." He came in and sat down, and for the first time since she'd begun this work, he reached out and picked up her notebook, not flipping through it, just holding it, looking at the page it was open to. She watched him read. "This is double billing," he said. "Yes, he paid the legitimate supplier and then paid the fraudulent account for the same work. 4 confirmed instances in the third ledger. I'm 4 hours into the fourth. I've found 2 more already." He set the notebook down carefully, looked at her. "What's the total so far? Everything confirmed." She turned to the summary page she'd begun keeping at the back of the notebook. Inflated invoices across 1813 and 1814, $431. Hartwell and Sons fraudulent payments, $214. Double billing, third ledger, $283. Double billing, fourth ledger, so far, $111. Household ledger, summer 1813. "I've identified irregularities but haven't calculated them yet." She paused. "Confirmed total, as of this hour, $1,039. He said nothing. "I have 2 more ledgers and the household account still to finish." She said, "My estimate from yesterday of $1,500 to $3,000 is still the right range. The upper end of that range is now more likely." He stood and walked 3 steps and stopped, and she understood that the number wasn't shocking because of its size alone, but because of what it represented. 3 years of a man he'd trusted, looking him in the face every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, and lying with perfect composure. "I want to confront him," Nathaniel said. "Not yet," she said immediately. He turned. "If you confront him now with an incomplete accounting, he'll minimize what you have and argue the rest is error. He'll have explanations ready. Careful men always do. You need the complete picture first. Every dollar confirmed and documented. Then when you face him, there's no room." He looked at her for a long moment. "How much longer?" "Tomorrow," she said. "I can finish by end of day tomorrow if I start early." "All right," he said. "Tomorrow." He picked up his hat. "Don't go anywhere alone." "You said that yesterday." "I'll say it every day until this is done," he said, and his voice had an edge under it that was not aimed at her, but was close enough that she felt it. She looked back at her notebook. "Mr. Ashford." He paused. "When I finish the accounting," she said carefully, "and we have the complete figure." "What will you do?" He didn't answer immediately. "I'll pursue legal remedy," he said. "Restitution, whatever the law allows. And the tenants," she said, "the estate workers. Some of what's been diverted may have come at their expense. Wages or materials that were recorded but not delivered." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she might have overstepped, but when he spoke, his voice was level and without defensiveness. "Whatever is owed to them will be made right," he said. "I give you my word on that." She believed him. She wasn't certain why she had known him 3 days, and she had good reason from experience to be cautious about believing men's words. But the way he said it had the quality of a statement rather than a promise, as though the question had already been settled in his own mind, and he was simply reporting it. "Thank you," she said. He left. Eliza turned to the 4th ledger, found her place, and kept going. She was deep in the 5th ledger 2 hours past the point where her eyes had begun to ache when she heard the door. Not the main door, the side door, the one off the corridor that the household used. It opened and closed with the quick, deliberate quietness of someone who was trying not to be heard. She looked up. The corridor was empty. She sat very still and listened. Footsteps, but stopping. The way footsteps stop when someone realizes they may have made a sound. Then nothing. She looked at the ledgers on the table, at her notebook, at the invoice boxes with their careful organization. She stood up, crossed the room quickly, and turned the key in the study lock. She stood with her hand on the door, and her heart moving fast, but her mind very clear. The same clarity she'd felt at the Havford dinner table, when she'd swallowed her words and made her calculation. Cost versus cost. What she had versus what she stood to lose. She went back to the table, sat down and kept working, but she moved the notebook to her lap. 3 minutes passed, then 5, then someone tried the door handle. It turned, met the resistance of the lock, and stopped. A pause. Then footsteps moving away back down the corridor, quiet and purposeful. She did not move for a full minute after the sound was gone. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote down the time in the margin of her notebook, and below it, 2 words. "He knows." She turned to the next page of the ledger. There were 46 pages left. She was going to finish tonight. She finished at 11 that night. The candles had burned low, and her back ached from 6 hours without moving, and her right hand had a cramp in it that she'd been ignoring for the last 40 minutes. But the final column was totaled. The final discrepancy recorded, and the number at the bottom of the last summary page, was the kind of number that sat in the chest like a stone. $3,214 across 4 years of quarterly accounts, 1 fraudulent supplier, systematic double billing, and a household ledger that Clayton had used like a personal account during the 4 months of unsupervised control in 1813. $3,214, every cent documented, every discrepancy cross-referenced against the original invoices, every fraudulent Hartwell & Sons payment, traced to the dates and the corresponding real payments that proved the double billing wasn't an accident. She closed the last ledger and sat in the quiet of the locked study and felt something she hadn't let herself feel for the past 3 days, because feeling it would have slowed her down. Rage. Clean, cold, specific rage. Not the hot kind that made you reckless, but the kind that had been sitting under the work the entire time, kept in its place by the discipline her father had taught her. And now that the work was done, it rose to the surface, and she let it. $3,000. Taken from an estate whose tenants she'd seen on the drive in the worn fences, the underfed look of the livestock in the near pasture, the road that needed grading. $3,000 that had gone into Clayton's pocket, while Nathaniel's uncle was too ill to check, and Nathaniel himself hadn't yet arrived. And Clayton had looked at every one of those Tuesdays as an opportunity, not an obligation. She picked up her pencil and wrote the final total one more time at the top of a clean page, underlined it twice, and closed the notebook. Someone had tried this door tonight. Tomorrow it ended. She didn't sleep well. She lay in her narrow bed in the Thornton house and listened to the summer dark and thought about Clayton's face in the study doorway, the assessment, the dismissal, the half-second of alarm when he'd seen the open notebook, and she thought about the footsteps in the corridor and the door handle turning and what it meant that he'd come to the property outside his scheduled time. He was not panicking. Panicking men made noise. He was recalibrating the way careful men do when they sense the ground moving quietly, methodically, looking for the shape of the threat before deciding what to do about it. She needed to move before he did. She was dressed before 6 and at the Ashford estate by 7:30, which was earlier than she'd come any previous morning. Reuben, the groundskeeper, saw her coming up the drive and nodded without surprise. Mrs. Whitaker had clearly said something. The housekeeper met her at the door. "Mr. Ashford's already up," she said. "I told him you'd want an early word. Is Clayton expected today?" "Not until Tuesday," Mrs. Whitaker said, "but yesterday wasn't Tuesday either." "No," Eliza said. "It wasn't." Nathaniel was in the front parlor with a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking, standing rather than sitting, which told her he'd been up since before she arrived, and probably hadn't slept much more than she had. He looked at her when she came in, at her face first, then at the notebook in her hand. "You finished," he said. "Last night." "Sit down," he said. "Tell me." She sat. He remained standing, which she understood. Some numbers are easier to hear on your feet. She opened the notebook to the final summary page and set it on the table between them. 3,214, she said. Confirmed and documented across the 1812 through 1815 accounts, including the household ledger from the summer of 1813. Every discrepancy is cross-referenced to its source document. The fraudulent Hartwell and Sons payments, 14 in total, are listed with the corresponding real payments that prove the double billing. The inflated invoices from the first method are tabulated separately. She paused. "I've also written a summary document that explains the method in plain language. If you bring this before a magistrate, you'll need something that can be read and understood by men who are not accountants." He had been looking at the summary page while she spoke. His expression was the controlled, contained expression of a man processing something large and keeping it contained by sheer force of habit. 3,000s, he said. "And $214, she said. "The precision matters. Every dollar is accounted for." He looked up. "The recommendations, I'd still like to see them." She said, "If the men who signed those letters were real, they may have been deceived themselves. If the letters were fabricated, that's an additional charge. I'll have them on the table within the hour." He finally sat down across from her in the same chair he'd occupied every day this week. He tried the study door last night. Yes, Reuben saw him on the property at 9. He said he'd left a document in the side hall. There was no document. She held his gaze. "He's not going to run," she said. "He's too careful for that. Running looks like guilt, and he'll know that without a full accounting he can argue error. He came back because he wanted to know how far the investigation had gotten." She paused. "I think he expected to find papers he could remove. He doesn't know the notebook exists. The notebook stays with you, Nathaniel said immediately. It does, she agreed. I wasn't planning to leave it on the table. He almost smiled. It was brief, just a shift at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. What do you recommend? She had thought about this carefully, lying awake in the dark. You bring him in today, don't wait until Tuesday. Send for him this morning on an ordinary business pretense. Tell him there's a question about the Southfield drainage costs that needs his input. He'll come, because refusing a summons would look worse than whatever he thinks you have. She folded her hands on the table. When he arrives, you have him sit down, and then you put the summary document in front of him. Not the ledgers, not yet, the summary. Let him see the total first, and then you ask him to explain it. Nathaniel looked at her. You want to be there. It was not quite a question. Yes, she said. I do. He was quiet for a moment. She knew what the hesitation was. Not doubt about her capability, not after this week, but the social mathematics of a woman present at a confrontation that was going to be ugly before it was resolved. I need to be there, she said quietly. Not for the satisfaction of it, because he's going to challenge the numbers, and you need someone in that room who can answer the challenge. Another pause, then he said, Mrs. Whitaker will be present as well. Of course, Eliza said. He stood. I'll send Reuben to Clayton's house within the hour. Be ready by 10 o'clock. Clayton arrived at 11:15 with the document case under his arm and the expression of a man who had spent the morning preparing. He had dressed well, better than a simple Tuesday meeting would warrant, which told Eliza he'd spent the ride over constructing his position, making himself look the part he intended to play. He came into the parlor and stopped when he saw Eliza. Mr. Ashford, he said, without looking away from her. I didn't realize this was a committee meeting. Sit down, Mr. Clayton, Nathaniel said. Something in the tone landed. Clayton sat. Nathaniel set the summary document on the table in front of him. I'd like you to read that. Clayton looked at it. He picked it up. He read it. And Eliza watched his face the way she'd been trained by years of necessity to watch faces, looking not for the dramatic reaction, but for the small one, the flicker that happened before control reasserted itself. It was there. A half second of something not surprise, because he'd known someone was looking, but the specific shock of a man seeing the full number for the first time, $3,214. He'd known something was wrong. He hadn't known how much. He set the document down. There are errors in this accounting, he said. His voice was steady, prepared. Several of these entries reflect legitimate contingency expenses that require context to understand. Which entries? Eliza said. He turned to her then, fully, with the deliberate slowness of a man deciding to acknowledge a presence he'd been ignoring. His expression was polite. I beg your pardon, Miss Thornton. She said, which entries do you believe reflect legitimate contingency expenses? Mr. Clayton, the committee arrangement is not standard practice for estate business, he said, addressing Nathaniel. I'd prefer to discuss these matters privately. Miss Thornton prepared this accounting, Nathaniel said. She'll be part of this discussion. Clayton's composure held, but only just. The Hartwell and Sons payments, he said, turning back to the document, represent purchases made from a supplier who operated outside the standard invoice system. The goods were delivered. The payments were legitimate. There are no delivery records, Eliza said, no receipts, no correspondence with Hartwell and Sons in the estate files, no evidence that the company exists at all outside of your ledger entries. Records get lost, Clayton said. That's not evidence of fraud. The double billing is, she said. She turned to her notebook and opened it to the third ledger section. October 14, 1814. Linen Brothers invoice, $31 South Barn timber, paid on the 15th. 2 days later, a payment of $40 to Hartwell and Sons, noted in your hand as Timber South Barn repairs. Same project, billed twice. I have 4 additional confirmed instances of this exact pattern across the third and fourth ledgers, and 2 in the household accounts. Clayton was quiet. If the records were simply lost, Eliza said, the double billing would not exist. Records get lost, payments do not get duplicated by accident in a consistent direction over 4 years. He looked at her with an expression that had shed the politeness now, down to something flatter and harder underneath. You're a woman reviewing accounts you don't fully understand, he said. The complexity of estate management over multiple years requires context that a brief review cannot supply. The room was very still. Mr. Clayton, Nathaniel said, and his voice was quiet in a way that was more dangerous than volume. I would advise you not to continue in that direction. But Eliza didn't need the defense. She had been at that dinner table. She had sat across from Margot's smile and swallowed it for 18 months. Clayton's contempt was not new. It was just wearing different clothes. The Hartwell and Sons payments total $846 across 14 entries, she said, as though he hadn't spoken. I have the corresponding real payments for every project those entries reference. The inflated invoices total $431. The double billing total $611. The household ledger irregularities total $326. She looked at him steadily. I don't require context to read arithmetic, Mr. Clayton. The arithmetic is very clear. Something in his face changed, then subtly deep under the careful surface, the way ice changes when the temperature shifts. He understood. She thought he understood that she had the entire accounting, that it was documented, that challenging the numbers one by one was not going to work, because she had anticipated every challenge and documented against it. He looked at Nathaniel. This is one woman's interpretation of complex accounts, he said. I have 3 years of service without complaint. I have recommendations, speaking of which, Nathaniel said, and set 3 letters on the table. Clayton looked at them, and this time the flicker in his face was unmistakable. Those are my letters of recommendation, he said. They are, Nathaniel said. I wrote to all 3 men this past week. 2 of them replied this morning. He picked up the first letter. Mr. George Aldrich of Westchester writes that, while he did employ a man named Clayton in 1809, he neither provided a letter of recommendation nor authorized anyone to write one on his behalf. He is in fact quite certain he would not have done so, as the man left his employee under disputed circumstances. He set it down and picked up the second. Mr. James Apprentice of Albany writes that he has never employed or met any person named Aaron Clayton, and that the signature on the letter purporting to be his is not his signature. The silence was complete. One letter remains unverified, Nathaniel said, but I believe the picture is sufficiently clear. Clayton sat very still. He looked like a man doing arithmetic, the same rapid, desperate arithmetic of a cornered position, counting exits, counting options, finding them closed one by one. I want legal counsel, he said. You're entitled to it. Nathaniel said, what you're not entitled to is Tuesday's meeting or continued access to this estate or the keys to the estate office, which I'll ask you to leave on this table before you go. A long pause. Then Clayton reached into his coat pocket and set a ring of keys on the table. The sound of them landing was very small. It was the loudest thing Eliza had heard all week. Nathaniel sent for the county magistrate that same afternoon. Eliza sat in the study and made 3 clean copies of the full accounting, one for the magistrate, one for Nathaniel's records, one for her own. In the careful, even hand her father had praised when she was 10 years old, and again when she was 15, and again the last time she saw him whole and well, the autumn before the fever, she made the copies without haste, without error, because the work deserved the same care at the end that it had received at the beginning. Mrs. Whittaker brought tea at 2 o'clock and sat down across from her, without asking permission, and watched her work in a silence that was companionable, rather than awkward. You weren't afraid of him, Mrs. Whittaker said eventually. I was, Eliza said without looking up. I'm better at not showing it than at not feeling it. That's the more useful skill, Mrs. Whittaker said. Eliza glanced up. Is that experience talking 40 years of running other people's households? Mrs. Whitaker said, Yes, I'd call that experience. She poured the tea. He'll try to negotiate with the magistrate. I mean, men like Clayton don't confess, they negotiate. He'll offer partial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. That's his right. Eliza said it is. Doesn't mean Mr. Ashford has to accept it. No, Eliza agreed. It doesn't. The housekeeper was quiet for a moment. What will you do now? Eliza set down her pen. It was the first time she'd stopped moving since 7:30 that morning. What would she do now? She looked at the 3 clean copies of the accounting on the table. $3,214 documented and organized and irrefutable. And she felt the weight of the question settle. Go home, she said, to the Thornton house. And then she thought about Margot, about the dinner table at the Havfords, about 18 months of careful silence, and the calculation she made every time. Cost of speaking, cost of silence, and how she had always, until this week, chosen silence. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but something's changed. Mrs. Whitaker nodded slowly, like a woman receiving an answer that confirmed what she'd already believed. Your father's estate, she said carefully. The Thornton accounts. Have you had access to them since Mrs. Thornton took over the management? Eliza looked at her. I'm asking, Mrs. Whitaker said, because I know what I just watched you find in these ledgers, and I know that your father was a careful man who built something real, and I know that careful men's careful work tends to go one of 2 ways after they're gone. It's either maintained or it's taken apart. She paused. I wonder which way it's gone, in your case. The thought had been in the back of Eliza's mind since the second day since she'd found the first double-billed entry, and thought almost involuntarily. Clayton has had access to the Thornton accounts too. He manages both estates. She hadn't let herself go further than that. She'd needed to finish this work first, and she'd known if she started thinking about the Thornton ledgers, she'd lose her focus on the Ashford ones. But the work was done now. Clayton manages the Thornton accounts as well. She said he does. Mrs. Whitaker said, has done since the autumn of 1813, 2 months after Edmund Thornton died. Eliza sat very still. She thought about Margot's confidence, about the ease with which her stepmother spent the new furniture, the French perfume, the jet combs that had belonged to Eliza's mother, about the way Margot spoke of the estate's finances, with the authority of someone who had looked at the numbers and found them satisfactory. What if the numbers Margot had looked at weren't the real numbers? What if Clayton had been running the same method-inflated invoices? Phantom suppliers double billing on the Thornton estate for 2 years, and Margot was either complicit or oblivious. And either way, Edmund Thornton's careful work was being eaten from the inside. I need to see the Thornton ledgers, Eliza said. Yes, Mrs. Whitaker said. I rather thought you'd say that. Nathaniel came back to the study at 4 o'clock with the news that the magistrate would arrive the following morning, and that Clayton had already sent word through his solicitor requesting a meeting before the formal proceeding. What did you tell him? Eliza said that he could speak to the magistrate. Nathaniel said the same as anyone else. He looked at the 3 copies of the accounting on the table. He picked up the top one and read through it, not scanning, reading the way she'd seen him read everything she'd put in front of him this week. And when he set it down, his expression was the same, careful, contained one, but something had shifted underneath it. Some of the tension that had been sitting in his jaw and his shoulders since Tuesday had released fractionally. This is complete, he said. Complete and verified, she said. Every entry, every cross-reference, every discrepancy documented against its source. Miss Thornton, he said, and paused. She waited. I don't know how to adequately. He stopped again, and she saw him reject whatever he'd been about to say and search for something truer. My uncle built this estate, his father before him. $3,000 is not a sum that would ruin it, but it would have continued to bleed it. And what mattered? He stopped a 3rd time. What mattered was that I was sitting across from that man every Tuesday, and I did not see it. and you came in here with a pencil and a notebook, and in 4 days you saw everything." She looked at him steadily. "My father spent 16 years teaching me to see it." She said it wasn't 4 days. It was 16 years. "Then I owe your father a debt as well," he said quietly. The light in the study had gone gold with the late afternoon, the kind of light that made everything look both very clear and very still. And for a moment she was aware of the specific quality of the silence between them, not empty, not awkward, but full of something that neither of them was going to name yet, because the moment was too new, and too much had just happened, and neither of them was foolish enough to rush it. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her. "Clayton manages the Thornton accounts," she said. "Has since the autumn of 1813. The stillness that followed was different from the earlier ones, sharper, more immediate. You think he's been running the same scheme on your family's estate," he said. "I think it needs to be looked at," she said. "I think my stepmother either knows and is complicit or doesn't know, and her estate is being gutted the same way yours was." She paused. "Either answer has consequences for me." He sat down. He looked at the notebook in her hand. The notebook that had in the last 4 days become something like an extension of her always present, always close. "If Margot is complicit," he said carefully, "she's a party to fraud. If she's ignorant, she's a victim of it." "Yes. And your position in either case is precarious," she said. "In either case." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to look at the Thornton ledgers?" "I need to," she said. "But I can't access them through the estate. Margot controls them. Would she give you access if you asked?" Eliza almost laughed. Not with humor, with the Rofal recognition of someone long familiar with a particular impossibility. She would sooner set them on fire. Nathaniel looked at her. "Then we need another way in," he said. "Clayton will be before the magistrate tomorrow morning. Depending on how that proceeds, his records, all his records across all the estates he manages, may become subject to legal review." Eliza understood immediately. If the magistrate issues an order for Clayton's records, the Thornton accounts would be included, Nathaniel said, along with anything else he's managed. She sat with that for a moment, the shape of it, the possibility opened in front of her like a door she hadn't known was there. "It would have to happen quickly," she said. "If Clayton understands the scope of the investigation, he'll move to protect himself." Nathaniel agreed. "Yes, then the magistrate needs to know about the Thornton connection tomorrow morning," she said. "Before Clayton has time to destroy anything," Nathaniel said. "Yes." He looked at her with an expression that was direct and steady, and carried something in it she didn't have words for yet. "Will you be here tomorrow morning?" She thought about going back to the Thornton house tonight, about Margot's voice. "Keep yourself presentable, don't make yourself tiresome," and about Clayton's keys dropping onto the table in that small final sound, about her father's voice patient and certain you'll never be lost. "Yes," she said. "I'll be here." He nodded. "Then we finish it tomorrow." She picked up her pen and pulled the 4th copy of paper toward her and began writing the addendum, the Thornton connection, the dates, the access, the names in the same careful, even hand. Outside, the summer evening was settling in. Somewhere down the drive, she heard Reuben closing up the outbuildings for the night. The sound of a gate latched the ordinary sounds of an estate at the end of a day. She kept writing. The magistrate arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. His name was Robert Hale, a compact, gay-haired man with the particular bearing of someone who had been delivering judgments for long enough that he'd stopped being surprised by what people did to each other. He arrived with a clerk carrying a leather writing case, his silence a palpable presence. He sat at the Ashford parlor table and, for 11 uninterrupted minutes, meticulously scanned Eliza's complete accounting. Eliza counted the seconds. When he finally finished, he placed the document down, its edges perfectly aligned with the tables, and met Nathaniel's gaze. "This is thorough work," he stated. "Who prepared it?" "I did," Eliza replied. He turned his gaze to her, a familiar, rapid assessment, passing over her features, the same scrutiny she'd endured from every man she'd encountered this week, a swift calculation of her worth and her standing. She met his eyes unflinchingly, waiting. "You've cross-referenced every discrepancy against the source invoice," he observed. "Yes, sir, all documented. The Hartwell and Sons entries," he continued. "You've confirmed the company doesn't exist. I've confirmed there are no delivery records, no correspondence, no invoices, and no independent evidence of the company's existence within the estate files," Eliza stated. "That is what I can confirm from the records available to me." She paused, then added, "A broader inquiry might uncover more." He regarded her for another moment before returning his attention to the document. "Mr. Ashford," he said, addressing Nathaniel, "you are seeking restitution and criminal charges." "I am," Nathaniel confirmed. "The fraudulent recommendations conveniently complicate the matter. 2 confirmed forgeries, as Hale mentioned, establish a pattern of deliberate deception predating the accounting fraud, which considerably strengthens the case." He gestured to the recommendation letters still on the table from the previous day. "These will need to be formally entered into the record." "They are yours," Nathaniel said. Hale nodded. He then looked back at Eliza. "You mentioned in the addendum that the subject also manages accounts for a second estate, the Thornton estate. You stated he's been the steward of records since October 1813. "I have reason to believe the same methods may have been applied there," Eliza said. "What reason?" "The method he employed here was refined over time," she explained, her voice steady. "It began with small, inflated invoices in 1812 and grew in complexity and amount by 1814. A man who has refined a method to that degree does not leave it idle when he has access to a second set of books." She paused. "I haven't seen the Thornton ledgers. I cannot make a confirmed finding, but the pattern and the access are both present." Hale turned to Nathaniel. "The Thornton estate, who manages it currently above the steward level?" "Mrs. Margot Thornton," Nathaniel replied, "widow of Edmund Thornton and the heir." A brief silence. "I am Edmund Thornton's heir," Eliza said. Hale looked at her, a subtle shift in his expression. Not dramatic, but undeniable. A reassessment. "You're the daughter?" "Yes, sir." "And you've had no access to the estate accounts since your father's death?" "None," she confirmed. "Mrs. Thornton controls the accounts." He was quiet for a moment, then picked up his pen and addressed his clerk. "Note that the inquiry extends to the Thornton estate accounts from October 1813 to the present. We'll require access to the full ledger records." He then looked at Eliza. "I will issue the order this morning. Clayton's records across all managed properties will be reviewed." A tightness in her chest, one she'd almost grown accustomed to, began to loosen. "Thank you," she murmured. "Don't thank me yet," Hale said, his tone devoid of unkindness. "Thank me when the numbers come back." Clayton arrived at 10:15, accompanied by a solicitor, his composure carefully constructed, betraying the night spent strategizing. He sat opposite Magistrate Hale, deliberately avoiding Eliza's gaze, a clear indication of his chosen strategy: deny her standing, challenge the methodology, and negotiate based on the figures without acknowledging the architect of the case. It was a reasonable approach, Eliza conceded internally, but one she suspected was doomed to fail. Hale laid the accounting on the table. "Mr. Clayton, this document represents a finding of $3,214 in irregular payments across your management of the Ashford estate from 1812 to 1815. I have read it in full. I would like your response." Clayton's solicitor, a lean man named Garrett, possessing the practiced ease of a seasoned arguer, leaned forward. "My client maintains that several entries in this accounting reflect legitimate estate expenses that have been mischaracterized due to incomplete context." "The methodology employed is cross-referencing," Eliza interjected. Garrett looked at her, a flicker of surprise. "I beg your pardon?" Every discrepancy in that document is referenced against its source invoice, she repeated. That's not methodology. That's arithmetic. If Mr. Clayton believes a specific entry is incorrectly characterized, he is welcome to identify it and present the documentation that supports the legitimate explanation. Garrett opened his mouth to speak. With respect, Hale said, his eyes still on the document. That is a reasonable standard. Mr. Clayton, which entries do you dispute? A pause. Clayton's composure held, but his eyes darted to the accounting, to the columns of figures, the cross-references, the totals. Eliza watched him comprehend the gravity of what he was seeing. He had seen her notebook in the study 2 days prior, and had known she was building something. Now, he saw the completed structure, flawless and complete. The Hartwell and Sons payments, Clayton said. 14 entries, totaling $846. Your position? Hale inquired. Legitimate purchases from a supplier who did not operate through standard invoice channels. The goods were delivered. The absence of paperwork reflects the supplier's business practices, not fraud. Can you produce the supplier? Hale asked. Another pause. He has since ceased operation, Clayton replied. Convenient, Hale stated, not with heat, but as a flat observation, the tone of a man noting a fact. The double billing entries. October 1814, Linen Brothers invoice $31, followed by a Hartwell and Sons payment of $40. The same project. 6 additional confirmed instances. Your explanation. Recording error, Clayton said. An error in the same direction, in the same amount, across 6 separate instances, over 14 months, in complex multi-entry accounting records. Hale questioned. Garrett attempted to intervene. My client is prepared to acknowledge certain accounting irregularities that may have resulted from the recommendation letters. Hale remained silent. Mr. George Aldrich, of Westchester, states he provided no letter of recommendation for your client, and that his signature on the letter in evidence is not his. He set the letter down. Mr. James, an apprentice of Albany, states he has never met your client, and the signature attributed to him is a forgery. He then looked directly at Clayton. Those are not accounting irregularities. Those are crimes committed before your client set foot on this estate. That establishes a pattern that substantially undermines any argument of accident or error in the accounting. Quote, the silence that followed was the kind that descends when a structure collapses, and everyone waits for the final piece to fall. Garrett leaned towards his client and spoke quietly. Clayton's face was rigidly controlled, a testament to his effort. Then he said something back, and Garrett straightened. My client, Garrett announced, is prepared to discuss terms of restitution. Nathaniel, who had been seated at the end of the table in an unyielding stillness for 40 minutes, spoke. Full restitution, every dollar confirmed in that accounting. My client can offer full restitution, Garrett responded, or I will pursue the maximum available charge on every count, including the forged recommendations, and I will do so publicly, Nathaniel stated. He paused. This county has a newspaper, Mr. Garrett. I have not yet contacted them. Another silence, shorter this time. Full restitution, Garrett conceded. Paid in installments over 1 year, Nathaniel countered. Garrett looked at his client. Clayton's jaw was clenched. 1 year, he said. Hale made a note. The Thornton estate accounts will be reviewed under a separate order. Any irregularities found there will be addressed as a distinct matter. He looked at Clayton. Mr. Clayton, you are suspended from all estate management responsibilities, pending the completion of this inquiry. You will make available all records, correspondence, and documents related to any property you currently manage. Refusal to comply will be treated as obstruction. He closed his ledger. We're done here. Clayton stood, collecting his document case, and then, for the first time since entering the room, he looked directly at Eliza. It wasn't a look of threat, but something colder, the gaze of a man filing away information, noting a loss, and identifying its cause. She held his gaze without flinching. He turned and left. The room felt different after his departure. Not lighter, precisely. The work was far from over. The Thornton accounts remained unknown, Margot's role still unclear, but the acute pressure of the past 4 days had shifted. Something had been proven. Something was now in motion that could not be stopped. Hale shook Nathaniel's hand and offered Eliza a brief, serious nod, the acknowledgement of a man who did not offer praise lightly. "The documentation is the best I've seen from a private accounting review," he said. "Whoever trained you knew what they were doing." "My father," she replied. "Edmund Thornton." Hale paused. "I knew Edmund Thornton," he said. "A fine man, honest." He looked at her for a moment. He would have been pleased this morning. He departed with his clerk, leaving the parlor quiet. Nathaniel turned to look at her. She expected him to say something. For a long moment he simply looked at her with that direct, careful expression she had come to recognize this week as his version of openness, the look he wore when he wasn't performing, wasn't managing, but was simply present. "You did that," he said finally. "We did that," she replied. He shook his head slightly. "I handed you the ledgers. The rest was you." She didn't argue the point. She was tired, and it was partly true. And something in the simple, unqualified nature of his statement, without the subtle diminishment she had learned to expect from praise that came with a caveat, for a woman, or considering, resonated differently than she had anticipated. "The Thornton accounts," she said, needing to keep moving forward. "The magistrate's order will take a day or 2 to be formally served. Clayton will know it's coming." "Yes," Nathaniel confirmed. "If there's anything to find in those ledgers, he may try to access them before the order is served." "I've already sent a man," Nathaniel added, "to the Thornton estate. I asked Reuben to go personally. He has no connection to Clayton, with a note for Mrs. Whitaker's counterpart there. The household staff will be aware that the estate documents are not to be removed or altered." She looked at him. "You did that this morning." "Before Hale arrived," he said. She was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. He thought ahead. He moved quietly and without announcement, the same way he had navigated the Havford dinner, paying attention, filing, acting. She had noticed it from the first night. She was noticing it differently now. "Margot will know something's coming," she said. "Probably," he replied. "What do you want to do about that?" She considered it honestly, returning to the Thornton house that night, sitting across from Margot at the dinner table, observing her stepmother's carefully crafted social performance, holding this knowledge and saying nothing. That had been the calculation for 18 months, the cost of speaking versus the cost of silence. But the calculation had fundamentally changed. What she held now was not just knowledge, it was documentation, legal weight, a magistrate's order already in motion. "I need to go home," she said. "I need to be there when the order arrives." "I'll ride with you," Nathaniel said, immediately. She started to protest that it wasn't necessary. He looked at her with an expression that forestalled objection, not commanding, not dismissing her capability, but the quiet, certain expression of a man who has made a decision based on his own values and isn't seeking negotiation. "Very well," she said. The Thornton house was silent when they arrived in the late afternoon. Too silent. The kind of silence that signals someone inside knows something is coming and has chosen stillness over flight. Margot was in the front parlor. She was dressed as though she'd expected guests, meaning she'd had ample warning to prepare, meaning someone had apprised her of the situation. She looked at Eliza, then at Nathaniel Ashford, her expression shifting through 3 stages in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and finally, a smoothly executed welcome that Eliza had witnessed countless times, never with admiration. "Mr. Ashford," she said, rising. "What a pleasant surprise." Eliza, you might have told me you were bringing a guest. We've come on a legal matter, Eliza stated. Margot's smile remained fixed. Legal matter. How very dramatic. She turned to Nathaniel with that particular gaze she reserved for men of means. Warm, confiding, a touch helpless. I do hope there's nothing amiss. Eliza tends toward the theatrical. Theatrical, Nathaniel replied pleasantly. Would be $3,000 missing from my estate accounts. He sat without invitation. Please be seated, Mrs. Thornton. This will take a few minutes. The warmth in Margot's expression didn't falter, but something behind it recalibrated. She sat. Eliza placed her notebook on the table. Mr. Clayton has been suspended from all estate management responsibilities, Eliza announced. A magistrate's order is being prepared that will bring the Thornton accounts under legal review. We're here to inform you of that before the formal notification arrives. Margot glanced at the notebook. I don't understand what Aaron Clayton has to do with 3 years of fraud on the Ashford estate. Documented and confirmed, Eliza said. He begins restitution within the year. She paused. He has managed the Thornton accounts for the same period, using the same access and the same methods. Margot's composure held. Eliza had always assumed Margot had built her entire social standing on the bedrock of composure, and she was exceptionally skilled at it. That is a very serious allegation. It is, Eliza agreed, which is why the magistrate will review the ledgers rather than taking my word for it. The ledgers are private estate documents. Margot, Eliza corrected, dropping the formalities. I manage this estate, and I have no obligation to you. You have every obligation when a court order is served, which it will be within 2 days at most. Margot looked at him. The warmth had completely vanished. Mr. Ashford, I have managed this estate competently and honestly since Edmund's death. Whatever Aaron Clayton has or hasn't done on your property has no bearing on. Were you aware of the Hartwell and Sons payments? Eliza asked. A flicker of something, a pause barely a fraction of a second, crossed Margot's face. I don't know what that refers to. It's a line item in the Ashford ledgers, Eliza explained. Payments to a fictitious supplier, 14 entries totaling $846. If the same method was used here, there will be a similar line item in the Thornton accounts. I have no reason to think. Margot, Eliza interrupted, abandoning the pretense of formality, the name stripped of its social architecture. The magistrate is going to look at those ledgers. If you knew what was in them, you need a solicitor before that order arrives. If you didn't know, then you've been defrauded the same as Mr. Ashford was, and the sooner the accounts are reviewed, the sooner we know what's been taken. The parlor was intensely quiet. Margot sat still for a long moment. Eliza watched her, trying to read her honestly, not with the accumulated hostility of 18 months, but with the same clear, factual attention she had given the ledgers. What did the evidence actually say? What was the more likely truth? The flash of recognition at the words, "and sons," could have been guilt. It could also have been fear. The fear of someone who had trusted a man she shouldn't have, and was only now grasping the cost of that trust. The accounts are in the estate office, Margot said finally. Her voice had changed, not broken, but the performative layer had fallen away, revealing something more genuine beneath. Off the east corridor, Clayton has the key, but there's a copy in Edmund's desk. Eliza looked at her steadily. Thank you. I want to know what's in them, Margot said. Then with the abrupt, unguarded directness of someone who had stopped calculating and started being frightened. How bad is it going to be? I don't know yet, Eliza replied honestly. I need to look. The estate office was cold, despite the summer heat outside. It was a north-facing room that Edmund had used for serious work, and it still held a faint scent of his pipe tobacco, which struck Eliza somewhere in the sternum as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. She stood there for a moment, letting the feeling wash over her. Then she crossed to the desk and opened the ledger cabinet, pulling out the first book. Nathaniel stood in the doorway. Do you want me to leave you to it? "Stay," she said, not looking up. "Please." He entered and sat in the chair against the wall. Eliza opened the first ledger to January 1813 and began to read. It took her 40 minutes to find the first discrepancy, then the second. Then, with the terrible efficiency of a pattern already recognized, the rest came quickly. The method was identical. Inflated invoices, small and consistent. A supplier listed as Hartwell and Sons appeared in the Thornton accounts in March of 1814, 8 months after the same name had appeared in the Ashford ledgers, imported wholesale from one estate to the other, with the confidence of a man who knew no one was comparing them. By the end of the first ledger, she had confirmed discrepancies of $312. She turned to the second ledger, her hands steady, her face still. And somewhere beneath it all, her father's voice said quietly, without comfort, "You'll never be lost." "How much?" Nathaniel asked from across the room. "First ledger, $312 confirmed," she replied. "I have 2 more years to go." She turned the page. "It's going to be significant." How significant? She kept reading, her finger tracing down the column. "I need to finish." He didn't ask again. She worked for another hour. When she finally closed the third ledger and leaned back, looking at her notebook, the number at the bottom of the summary page was $1,843. Nearly $2,000 taken from the estate her father had built, from the inheritance that was supposed to be hers, from the house she had grown up in, from the tenants who had worked the land, from the future that Edmund Thornton had spent his life constructing out of patience and arithmetic, and the belief that a woman who could read numbers would never be at anyone's mercy. She sat with it for a moment. Just a moment. Then she wrote the total, underlined it, and closed the notebook. 1,843, she said. Nathaniel was silent. Combined with the Ashford fraud, Clayton has taken over $5,000 from 2 estates in 3 years, she stated. That's what the magistrate will have. Yes, Nathaniel confirmed. She stood up. I need to speak to Margot. Margot was still in the parlor. She hadn't moved, which told Eliza more than words could. Margot was never still, never without motion and management and the performance of being in control. The woman sitting in the chair when Eliza returned was someone she hadn't seen before. Somehow smaller, more real. How much? Margot asked. 1,843, Eliza said, referring to the 1813 to 1815 accounts. Margot closed her eyes. Did you know? Eliza asked. A long silence. I knew the accounts had been variable, Margot said carefully. I knew some quarters were tighter than I expected. Clayton always had explanations. Costs up, yield down, repairs needed. She opened her eyes. I'm not trained in accounts. Edmund always... I relied on the steward. I know, Eliza said. I didn't know it was theft. I want that to be clear, Margot insisted. Whatever else I didn't know, it wasn't theft. Eliza looked at her, at the woman who had spent 18 months systematically dismantling her reputation at every dinner table and in every parlor, with the patient, deliberate confidence of someone who believed she would never be called to account. At the woman who had taken her mother's combs and redecorated her father's study and told a room full of people that Edmund Thornton's daughter couldn't read. She considered what she wanted to say. She had imagined this moment, some version of it, in the back of her mind for 18 months. The moment when the balance shifted, the words she'd swallowed at every table. What she said was, "You're going to need a solicitor, and you're going to need to cooperate fully with the magistrate's inquiry. If you didn't know about the fraud, cooperation is the thing that establishes that clearly." Margot looked at her. Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly, and it wasn't warmth. It was something more complicated, the recognition of being offered a fair accounting by someone who had reason not to. You're not going to, Margot began, then stopped. I'm going to get back what belongs to this estate, Eliza stated. That's Edmund Thornton's money, his work, his tenants who've gone without because of it. She paused. What happens to you, depends on what you did and what you knew. The magistrate will make that determination, not me." Margot was silent for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice stripped of all its social machinery, "You're very like him, Edmund." Eliza didn't respond. She picked up her notebook and her satchel and walked to the door. She stopped there, the way Nathaniel had, the way Mrs. Whitaker had, the way people do when there's one more thing that needs to be said. "The combs," she said, without turning around. "The jet combs you've been wearing. They were my mother's. I'd like them back, please." A silence. She heard Margot stand. She heard the small sound of movement, and then Margot's voice, quieter than she'd ever heard it. "They'll be on your dresser tonight." Eliza walked out into the corridor where Nathaniel was waiting, and she kept walking until they reached the front door, and then she stopped, standing in the evening air, and breathed. He stood beside her, not close, not imposing, just present in the steady, particular way that had become familiar over this strange and consequential week. "You all right?" he asked. She thought about the honest answer, about everything that had shifted in the last 5 days. The ledgers, the numbers, the doorknob turning in the dark, Clayton's keys dropping on the table, Hale's brief nod, Margot's face when she said, "I didn't know it was theft." About her father's voice in the estate office, the smell of pipe tobacco, and the total at the bottom of the page. "I will be," she said. He nodded once, accepting it as the complete truth it was. "Come back to Ashford House tomorrow," he suggested. "When the formal order is served on the Thornton accounts, I'd like you there." "Yes," she said. "And Miss Thornton." He paused, the same pause she had come to wait for. "When this is finished, all of it, the magistrate's process, the restitution, I'd like to discuss what comes next. For the estate? For you?" He held her gaze. "Your father built something real here. I'd like to see it stay that way." She looked at him in the golden light of the evening. In his face, she read nothing but exactly what he had said, no more, no less. And she thought that was perhaps the rarest quality in any man she'd met, the ability to mean precisely what he said, and to say precisely what he meant. "So would I," she said. She rode home through the summer evening, with her notebook in her lap, and her mother's combs waiting for her on the dresser, and for the first time in 18 months, the Thornton house felt like something worth coming back to. The magistrate's formal order arrived at the Thornton estate on a Thursday morning, 2 days after Eliza had sat in her father's estate office and read what Clayton had taken. She was already there when Hale's clerk came up the drive. She'd arrived early, just as she'd arrived early at the Ashford study every morning that week, not because she'd been asked to, but because the work wasn't finished, and unfinished work carried a particular weight that she'd never been able to ignore and sleep through. She was in the estate office, the Thornton ledgers spread open, when she heard the knock at the front door. She heard Margot's voice in the entry hall, then silence, then footsteps approaching the office. Margot appeared in the doorway, the order in her hand, her face composed in that careful, strained way of a woman holding herself together by sheer force of will. She held the document out without speaking. Eliza took it, read it, and set it on the desk beside her notebook. "The clerk will return this afternoon with a representative from the magistrate's office to take formal custody of the ledgers. Eliza said they'll need everything: the estate accounts, the household accounts, the correspondence file with Clayton." "I know," Margot said. "Is there anything in those files that you haven't told me about?" A pause. Margot's gaze drifted over the open ledgers on the desk, Eliza's careful annotations in the margins, the market pages, the notebook filled with columns of figures. Something in her expression underwent a private reckoning that Eliza didn't attempt to decipher. "No," Margot said, "nothing." "All right," Eliza said. Margot didn't leave. She stood in the doorway, hands clasped, with the particular stillness of a woman who had more to say, but wasn't sure she had the right to speak it. "I've engaged Mr. Fowler as my solicitor," she said finally. "He advises full cooperation." "That's wise," Eliza said. He also advised me. Margot stopped, then started again. He told me that as the named heir on Edmund's estate documents, you have standing to petition for direct oversight of the accounts during the inquiry period, rather than having them managed by the magistrate's office alone. She paused. I told him I wouldn't contest it. Eliza looked up from the ledger. Margot met her gaze. It was not a warm look. It was not the look of a woman who had undergone a transformation and emerged soft and remorseful. It was the look of a woman who had made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion she intended to honor, even though it cost her. Thank you, Eliza said. Don't, Margot said shortly. It's the right thing, that's all. She turned and walked back down the corridor. Eliza sat for a moment in the quiet of her father's office, feeling the weight of that exchange settle. Not resolution, not yet, but something real, something that might, in time, become workable. She turned back to the ledger and kept working. Nathaniel arrived at noon. He came through the front door without ceremony. Margot had apparently instructed the household to admit him, which was its own quiet statement. He found Eliza in the office with 3 ledgers open and her second notebook nearly full. He placed a paper-wrapped parcel on the corner of the desk without comment. Mrs. Whitaker sent lunch, he said. She said you forget to eat when you're working. She's not wrong, Eliza said. He sat down across from her. Where are you? Finishing the cross-reference on the 3rd ledger, I want to have the complete annotated accounting ready for the magistrate's representative this afternoon. She turned a page. I found 2 additional discrepancies this morning that I'd missed in the first pass. Brings the Thornton total to $1,961.60 more than yesterday. 63, she corrected. She said the method was cleaner here than on the Ashford accounts. He'd had 3 years to practice by the time he started on these. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He has a 3rd estate, he said. She looked up sharply. Haley told me this morning. Nathaniel said the Mercer property, 20 miles north. Small estate. Elderly owner died last year. His son came forward yesterday after word got out about Clayton's suspension. He'd had questions about the accounts for months, but didn't know who to bring them to. He paused. Hale is expanding the inquiry. The number in her head recalculated automatically. 3 estates, 5 years of refined method, a 3rd set of ledgers. How bad? The son doesn't have the full accounting yet, Nathaniel said, but his initial estimate is somewhere between $800 and $1,200. She sat back. Clayton has taken somewhere between $6,000 and $7,000 from 3 Hudson Valley estates over 5 years. From men who trusted him and from their families after them. Yes, Nathaniel said. The forged recommendations were how he moved between properties, she said, thinking aloud. Each estate gave him access to the next. 3 years at one, move on before the pattern becomes visible, leave with a fabricated letter, and start fresh. Except he didn't leave the Ashford estate. Nathaniel said he stayed because my uncle's illness gave him unsupervised access, and he didn't want to give that up. Nathaniel said he got comfortable. That was his mistake. Comfort is always the mistake. Eliza said, Careful men stop being careful when no one's watching long enough. She turned back to the ledger. Then she stopped and looked at him. The Mercer family. Do they have anyone who can read the accounts? Someone who can do what I've done here? The son is not trained in it. Nathaniel said he knows something's wrong, but he can't document it. She was quiet for a moment. I'll go when this is finished, she said. If the magistrate needs an independent accounting for the Mercer estate, I'll do it. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. That's 3 estate accounting reviews in a month. I know that's work, he said. Real, sustained work. The kind that should be compensated. She looked at him. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. She had thought about it as necessary, as what the situation required, as the thing her particular capabilities were suited to address. She had not thought about it as a profession. I'm not sure a woman in Hudson Valley in 1815 is paid for accounting work. She is, if I'm the one engaging her, Nathaniel said, and if the engagement is documented and the compensation is set out in writing before the work begins. He held her gaze. Your father trained you for 16 years. That training has a value. What you've done on these 2 estates has a value. The Mercer family needs that value, and they should pay for it. She felt something shift quietly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The same shift that had happened at the Havford dinner table, when she'd pressed her fingernails into her palm and made a promise, except this one was different in direction. That one had been about not being diminished. This one was about being actually, practically, materially seen. All right, she said. He nodded once. Finish the Thornton work first, he said. The Mercer accounting can wait until next week. She looked at him. You've already spoken to the son. Yesterday evening, he said. I told him I knew someone who could help. He paused. I hope that was all right. She thought about saying something about the presumption of it, about speaking on her behalf without asking first. She decided it wasn't presumption. It was the act of a man who had watched her work for a week and understood what she could do and had acted accordingly, which was a different thing entirely. It was all right, she said, and turned back to the ledger. The magistrate's representative arrived at 3 o'clock and took custody of the ledgers and Clayton's correspondence file with the formal, careful efficiency of legal process. He noted Eliza's annotated accounting in the record, accepted the 3 clean copies she'd prepared, and told her that Magistrate Hale had requested her presence at the formal hearing the following Tuesday. After he left the house, it was very quiet. Eliza sat in her father's office, the now empty desk before her, and the notebook in her lap, and felt the particular stillness of completed work. Not emptiness. It wasn't emptiness. It was the clean, specific quiet of a thing done well and done fully, with nothing left undone and no corners cut. She opened the notebook to the first page, her own handwriting, 4 days of it, column after column. She turned to the summary pages, both estates, every dollar, every name. She thought about her father sitting across from her at the counting house desk, patient and certain, saying, "These are the bones of a household." She thought about what he'd built, and what it had cost him, and what it had meant that he'd put that knowledge in her hands instead of safeguarding it somewhere she couldn't reach it. He'd known, she thought. He'd known the world would not hand her anything, and he'd known the world could not take away what she could read, and what she could find, and what she could prove. "You'll never be lost," he'd said. She closed the notebook. She wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was. The Tuesday hearing was the largest room Eliza had been in that wasn't a social occasion. Hale ran it with the same compact efficiency she'd seen in the Ashford parlor. Methodical, unhurried, fair. Clayton was present with Garrett. The Mercer son, a nervous young man named William, sat to Eliza's left and looked at the proceedings with the expression of someone trying to understand a language he'd been told he needed. She had gone to the Mercer estate on Saturday and spent 2 days on their accounts. What she'd found was consistent with the pattern, somewhat less sophisticated. Clayton had been more careful on the Ashford and Thornton estates, probably because they were larger and he expected more scrutiny. The Mercer total was $942, which she'd documented and delivered to Hale on Monday morning. Combined total across 3 estates, $6,851. 5 years of systematic fraud. When Hale read the combined figure into the formal record, the room was very quiet. Clayton's expression did not change. He had the face, Eliza thought, of a man who had accepted a position and was now focused entirely on minimizing its consequences. Garrett was good, she would grant him that, and the negotiation that followed was careful and protracted, and ultimately arrived at a full restitution agreement across all 3 estates, payments structured over 18 months, with Clayton's property and assets pledged against default. It was not a perfect resolution. $6,000 and 5 years of damage to 3 households was not a thing that could be fully repaid in money, and the men and women who'd worked those estates and gone without because of what had been drained from them would not see every effect reversed by a magistrate's order. Eliza knew that she had sat with it the night before and let herself feel the limits of what documentation and arithmetic could actually do, but it was something. It was the most that the available tools allowed, and she had used those tools as well as they could be used, and that had to be enough. Hale looked at her after the agreement was signed and said, "Miss Thornton, the court record will reflect your accounting as the basis of this proceeding. That's not something that's often said of private review work. It should be." She thanked him. She meant it. Nathaniel walked out with her into the summer air, and they stood in the brightness of it for a moment without speaking. "It's done," he said. "The formal part," she said. "The restitution will take 18 months. "I know, but the finding is done." He turned to look at her. "How do you feel?" She thought about the honest answer, the way she'd been thinking about honest answers all week. "Like I want to keep going," she said. "There are other estates, other accounts being managed by men. No one is checking. Other inheritances being eaten from the inside." She paused. "I know what to look for now. I know how to find it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a practice," he said. "What you're describing, an accounting practice. I know, in 1815, Hudson Valley." "I know that too," she said. "I'm not saying it would be easy." "No," he agreed. "It wouldn't be." He looked at her steadily. "But you have 3 documented cases, a magistrate who's seen your work, and the Ashford name behind you if you want it." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a beat, not hesitating, she thought, but choosing his words with the care she'd come to associate with him. "It means that I manage a large estate with ongoing accounting needs, and I'd like to engage you formally as my independent accounts reviewer on a regular basis, with a written agreement and proper compensation." He paused. "It also means that whatever you choose to build beyond that, the practice, the reputation, the clients, the Ashford Estates endorsement, is yours to use. My name on a letter of introduction will open doors that would otherwise take years." She stood with that for a moment. The shape of it, the actual, practical shape of a future she had not let herself imagine concretely, because imagination without means is just a different kind of grief. "And the other thing," she said. He looked at her. "You said the Ashford name if I want it." She said there are 2 ways to mean that. He held her gaze with the direct, careful expression that she had learned was his version of complete honesty. No performance, no management, just the truth as he had it. "There are," he said. "I'm aware of both of them. I didn't intend to conflate them, and I don't intend to press you on either. The professional offer stands on its own." He paused. "The other is also real, but it's separate, and it doesn't come with conditions." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had handed a stranger his most private ledgers, based on the observation that she was exercising restraint instead of confusion. Who had stayed on the correct side of every line this week, without being asked to, and without expecting acknowledgement for it? Who had sent a writer to the Thornton estate before the magistrate arrived and arranged the Mercer engagement without making it feel like management? Who had not laughed at the Havford dinner table? "I'll take the professional arrangement," she said. "I'd like to discuss the terms when you're ready." "Monday," he said. "Come to the estate at 9. "I'll be there," she said. She turned to go. She took 3 steps and stopped. The pause, her own version of it, now learned from a week of watching him, and turned back. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "the other thing that you mentioned." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying not yet. There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a warmth that was quieter and more lasting than either. "I know the difference," he said. "Take all the time you need." She turned and walked toward the road, and the summer was bright and hot and real around her, and she felt precisely, specifically, without any performance of it, free. 3 months later, in the first week of October, Eliza Thornton sat at a writing desk that was her own. Not the Thornton House desk, which had been Margot's for 2 years. Not the estate office desk, which still smelled of her father's work, and which she visited but had not yet claimed. Her own desk, in the 2-room office she had taken above the Pusapee Land Registry, with a sign on the door that read E. Thornton, Accounts Review, in letters she had painted herself on a Monday morning, while the ink was still wet on her first formal client agreement. The Ashford estate was her anchor client. The Mercer family, grateful and newly careful, had engaged her on a continuing basis. A fourth client had come to her through William Mercer's recommendation, a widow in Kingston, who'd had doubts about her late husband's former business partner for years, and had never had anyone who could read the books the way they needed to be read. Eliza could read the books. Mrs. Whitaker had sent a crate of preserves and a letter that was 2 paragraphs of practical advice and 1 sentence of genuine warmth, which was, Liza had decided precisely the right ratio for Mrs. Whitaker. The letter sat on the corner of her desk, where she could see it. Her mother's jet combs were in a small box in her desk drawer. She wore them on Sundays. Margot had stayed in the Thornton house through the magistrate's process. The inquiry had confirmed she'd had no knowledge of the fraud. She had trusted Clayton, and he had taken advantage of that trust with the same efficiency he'd applied everywhere else. The finding had not been kind to Margot's pride, which was perhaps the most meaningful consequence she'd faced. She had written Eliza a letter in September, brief, formal, without sentimentality, acknowledging that the estate accounts were being reviewed quarterly by a professional accountant at her own instruction, and that she intended to keep it that way. It was the closest thing to an apology Margot was capable of producing. Eliza had read it twice and put it in her files and decided it was enough. The hearing for Clayton's first restitution payment was in November. Hale had sent word that the proceeding was on schedule. Eliza was on the formal record as the accounting expert and had been asked to be present, which she would be. The knock at the office door came at 9, which was when she had told Nathaniel to come by to review the Ashford quarterly accounts. "Come in," she said. He came in with his hat in his hand and a leather case under his arm, and he looked at her desk, at the organized ledgers, the clean notebook, the sign on the door that he'd seen for the first time last week, and looked at it for a moment in a way she hadn't tried to interpret, and he pulled out the opposite chair and sat down. "The quarterly numbers are ready," he said. "Good," she said. "Set them here." He opened the case and laid the ledger on the desk between them, and she opened it and picked up her pencil, and they worked through the morning accounts together, the way they had been doing for 3 months. Him with his questions and his specific, careful intelligence, her with her pencil and her eye for the bones of a thing, and between them a working understanding that had grown with each meeting into something neither of them had tried to define, because it didn't require definition to be real. At 11 o'clock, she set her pencil down and looked at the quarterly summary. "Clean," she said. "Every entry reconciles. The drainage project came in under estimate. Reuben does good work," Nathaniel said. "He does." She closed the ledger. "I have a question." He looked at her. "The Havford dinner is in December," she said. "They throw one every year. I'll be invited through the Thornton house." "Yes," he said. "Will you be there?" "I'll be there," he said. She looked at him. "There's a seat to the right of the host," she said. "It usually goes to whoever Gerald Havford considers the most significant guest. Last year, that was a shipping merchant from Albany." She paused. "This year, I believe he's hoping to seat you there." "Probably," Nathaniel said. "The seat next to it," she said, "is traditionally offered to the most notable woman present." She held his gaze steadily. "I imagine there's some question in the county about who that will be this year." He looked at her for a moment. "I imagine there's no question at all," he said. "Not to anyone who's been paying attention." She thought about the Havford dining table a year ago, the candlelight, the crystal, Margot's voice cutting across the room. The girl can barely read a dinner invitation. The pain she'd pressed down into her palm, the promise she'd made in the silence that followed. She thought about what she'd done since then, the ledgers, the numbers, the notebook that had sat in her lap through a locked door, and a turning handle, and a late-night tally that added up to 5 years of theft, laid bare by a woman with a pencil, and 16 years of her father's teaching. She thought about the desk she sat at now, with her own name on the door. "Then I'll see you in December," she said. He stood and picked up his hat. He paused at the door. One more pause, one more last thing, and looked back at her with the expression she had come to know better than almost any other. Direct, warm, certain of what it was, without needing to announce it. "Miss Thornton," he said, "for what it's worth, I still think the same thing. I thought that first night in the Havford Library." "What's that?" she said. "That you were deciding something," he said, "and that whatever you decided was going to matter." He left. Eliza sat at her desk in the October morning, with her pencil in her hand, and her name on the door, and her mother's combs in the drawer, and 4 clients who needed someone who could read the bones of a thing and find what was hidden in them, and she understood clearly, fully, without a shadow of doubt, that her father had been right. She was never going to be lost.